Before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know our ad free subscriptions are now live on both Apple Podcasts and Spreaker, our podcast host. Both Apple and Spreaker subscriptions are $4.99 per month and give you access to our entire back catalog as well as every upcoming episode completely ad free, listening without interruption. If you'd rather not pay the $4.99 per month, don't fret. Everything we produce is still free, just supported by ad revenue. This revenue helps fund the nonprofit we support, Outreach Idaho, helps us pay for the cost of running this series, and pays us back for the time it takes to run Sons of Patriarchy. If you want to use a subscription, make sure you press the subscription-only episodes in order to get those ad-free episodes. Now, on to the episode. All right, we got our next guest coming on, somebody who may not have been himself on the receiving end of Doug Wilson or anybody else who've been to CREC, but he's got a lot of information on the movement and has been kind of seeing the movement and somewhat been influenced by the movement, at least early on. But if you can introduce your name and then if you want to, were you pastor or anything like this, and kind of how you first got started with Doug Wilson and anything to do with Doug Wilson in the beginning.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'm Wes Bredenhof. I'm currently the pastor of the Free Reformed Church of Launceston. This is in Tasmania, the small state in Australia. So not to be confused with Tanzania, as some people do. So I'm not in Africa, I'm in Australia. And prior to serving here, I served a couple of Canadian Reformed churches in Canada. And I began my ministry in 2000 as a missionary to a small First Nations community in north central British Columbia. So yeah, my introduction to Doug Wilson goes back a fair bit, long time ago. I first heard about him when I was a university student in the Canadian province of Alberta back in the early 1990s. So around that time in our Canadian Reformed Church community, there was a lot of discussion about theonomy and Christian Reconstruction. And there were some folks who were really pushing guys like Rick Bonson, Gary North, R.J. Rushdoony, guys like them. And these people who were pushing these authors, they knew I was a university student hoping to go to seminary. I was on a pretty tight budget. And so they told me about free publications like Chalcedon Report and Credenda Agenda. And around that time, I also got acquainted with Stillwater's Revival Books in Edmonton. That was the city I was living in. And at that time, they were promoting Doug Wilson as well. And then last of all, there were a couple of guys in another Reformed church in our city. So I went to the Canadian Reformed Church. These guys went to United Reformed Church, or what became a United Reformed Church. And these two guys, they were really big into the Christian Reconstruction stuff as well. And they were also students. They were hoping to go to seminary. And they were gushing about Doug Wilson and Credenda Agenda as well. So somewhere along the way, having heard from a number of people about it, I wrote to Credenda Agenda and I asked to get on their mailing list. And that's how I really first got acquainted with his writing, was through Credenda Agenda. And then that was the entryway into reading some of his books, especially his books on marriage and family. I think they came out in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, late 90s. At least that's when they started coming out. And at the time, I can remember thinking, I'm not sure if I'm bored with everything he says. I'm not sure if I'm completely on board with his eschatology or his theonomy and stuff like that. But he sounds reformed, right? And he's certainly got a witty way to express himself. He's very clever with his writing, very creative. So that kind of made him attractive to me. I was used to a style of writing, let's say in our church periodicals, that was a little bit more stodgy and stuffy and stoic and not very creative at all. So he was a breath of fresh air in that regard. So yeah, when I first got to hear about him back in the 90s, I guess you could say I was cautiously open-minded.
Okay. So maybe talk about too, before we get into kind of the deep waters, so you're on the show because you're not a fan of Doug Wilson, but were you at any point like was maybe talk to those who might be like, well, everybody on here is just kind of against him and they just got a bone to pick with him and they just don't like how he talks about culture and society and Christian nationalism. But at like, was there any point where like, I mean, I know you said that you weren't a fan of some of this stuff, but like was it compelling to you at all? Was there something was like, yeah, I can see parts of this stuff. Like were you always not a fan of him? Were there points where like, yeah, I'm not all on board, but I'm sort of on board.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. I was never like what you would call a fanboy.
Yeah.
Like the way I look at a fanboy is somebody, you know, for whom somebody like Doug Wilson can do no wrong. Like anything he does is always right. There's no critiquing him. There's no, and I never ever had that position on him. I always saw some of his what I would consider his weak points or points of that I had disagreements with him on. So yeah, I was never completely sold on him or anything like that. I've never been completely sold on anybody. I recognize that, you know, every theologian, every pastor, we're all just human beings, you know, and we're going to falter here or there and a lot of different places. And, you know, we have to take that into account. So, you know, to throw all your our trust into one man is a very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. So, you did not, I mean, obviously the Series C wasn't a thing until 97. So you were in Canadian Reformed churches. What was the influence like in Canadian Reformed churches? Because this is not in the Series C. And then what has it been like since I'm not sure how long you've been in Australia. What's the influence been like in Canada in the Reformed Church, and then the churches that you've pastored in Australia?
Yeah, that's evolved over time. Back in the 1990s, I think Doug Wilson's influence on the Canadian Reformed churches, that's the denomination that I came from, that I was born and raised into. I think it was pretty minimal. I think it was really restricted to the province of Alberta and particularly to northern Alberta
Hmm.
and the communities that I was involved with. That was back in the early 1990s. But I think over time, as especially as his books on family and marriage became better known, I think that started to change and his reputation and his influence started to expand in the 2000s. And part of that would have to do with a magazine that exists in the Canadian Reformed Church community. It's not a Canadian Reformed magazine. It's not operated by the
Mhm.
denomination or anything like that. But it was started within the denomination and it's been pretty influential. And it's called Reformed Perspective. And my friend John Dykstra, he's the editor of this magazine. And eventually, John discovered Doug Wilson for himself, not because of my drawing any attention to him or anything like that. At least I hope not. And John began promoting Doug Wilson quite heavily, and still to this day, you know, Reform Perspective, many issues of Reform Perspective. Many of he has this feature called Saturday Selections. Many times, John will feature a quote from, he calls him Reformed Pastor Doug Wilson. So I think Reformed Perspective has probably been the most instrumental way in which Doug Wilson has gotten a hearing in the church circles that I came from in Canada. Yeah, here in Australia, I came here in 2015. I had the call here in 2014, but I accepted and came here in 2015. Haven't really seen that much influence in my own church community from Doug Wilson. I think most people in my own church here would have no idea who he is, and I'd like to keep it that way. Um, However, I should say that there is a CREC, a correct congregation in the state of Tasmania. So, I mean, it's not as if the ideas are not, his ideas aren't out there and the connections aren't out there. They are, but they're relatively subdued. I mean, Australia is a totally different environment. Canada is what it is, partly because of the proximity to the United States, but here we're on the other side of the world. So If there is any promotion that happens with Doug Wilson, it would be because of people who have connections to the United States. Most recently, Tucker Carlson did that interview with Doug Wilson, and Martin Iles is an Australian political commentator. He was some time ago. He was the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby, and now he's with Answers in Genesis. I'm not sure if he's actually moved to Kentucky, but he's certainly heavily involved with Answers in Genesis with his fellow Australian Ken Ham. And after that interview with Tucker Carlson, Martin Iles promoted it, and he's got a big audience here in Australia. So, Doug Wilson's name gets out there by virtue of that, and his name gets into our church community then as a result of that, because our church community's got these strong connections to the Australian Christian Lobby, and Martin Iles because of his previous connection to the ACL.
Got it. I'm curious. This wasn't on my list of questions before, but I remember now you talking about it. You said it was the influence, at least early on, wasn't that widespread in Canada, but it was particularly so in Alberta. Why particularly so in Alberta?
I think it was originally because of the popularity, not, I wouldn't say popularity, but the voices promoting theonomy and Christian Reconstruction in Alberta at the time. Yeah, especially in northern Alberta, there were some people who had very loud voices, and they were actively promoting Greg Bahnsen, Gary North, all these, Chalcedon Report, R.J. Rushdoony, and then Doug Wilson gets lumped in there as well, along with them. So they're organizing conferences, and I remember there were a number of Christian Reconstruction conferences in Edmonton. I'm not sure if Doug Wilson ever spoke at any of those, but certainly Bahnsen did, and Steve Schlissel did, and they may have had other guys up there as well.
Okay. So you said early on it wasn't as much of a big deal. Has it since grown, at least in Canada, since then? And maybe if so, or at least in Canadian Reformed churches or in those sympathetic to either theonomy or Reconstructionism or whatever it is, has it grown since then? And if so, how has
Yeah.
it grown?
What really, I think, gave Doug Wilson a voice in the Canadian Reformed churches was the COVID crisis.
Okay.
I think his response to COVID echoed and resonated with a significant portion of the Canadian Reformed churches. They thought that's what we need to be doing. We need to be standing up like Doug Wilson stands up, and we need to, we can't listen to the government. We have to reject what the government is saying, because the government's trying to rule over the church, and all these different things. So I think after COVID, or during COVID and after COVID, I think that was really the catalyst for his getting much more of a voice in the circles that I've come from. Yeah.
Okay. So you started off at least with Doug or with anything that was writing, and then yeah, some of his writing on family might be okay, and some of his writing on marriage might be okay, and he's big in classical education, so people will get into this. How did you come to say I gotta write on this stuff. There's some stuff coming out in here that's not great, and I gotta let people know. So maybe to kind of back up a little bit, when did you start noticing I this is maybe not a movement that I want to be part of, and I need to let people know what this movement is
Yeah.
doing?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, so sit
We got
back,
time.
relax. So in the early 2000s, like I mentioned earlier, I was a missionary in north central British Columbia, and on occasion I had to go around to visit different churches around Canada to drum up support. And one of those trips brought me to southern Alberta. And one of those guys from Edmonton, from the other Reformed church that I mentioned, he was now a pastor in Lethbridge at the United Reformed Church there. So I contacted John Barrich and I said, "Hey, you want to get together? You want to catch up and find out what's going on?" And so we did. And John was really excited about an opportunity that he had to speak at a conference in Louisiana later that year. So this was 2002. So Norman Shepherd had been scheduled to be a speaker at this conference, but he had to bail out for some reason, and John was brought in to speak instead. And John told me that he was going to be speaking on some aspect or other of covenant theology. It sounded interesting, but I had no idea, what was going to come out of this. I didn't know it at the time that I met with John, but Doug Wilson was also going to be one of the speakers at this conference. So this is the Auburn Avenue Pastors Conference in 2002.
Huh.
And after the Auburn Avenue Pastors Conference in 2002, this thing known as Federal Vision just suddenly blew up in the Reformed world and got on everybody's radar. Even though I was living virtually at the edge of the earth. Well, it's not quite the edge of the earth, but you can see it from there. I was living in this remote village. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have internet. Still somehow it managed to reach even me at this remote corner. And I was on the Canadian board of Reformation Christian Ministries at the time. And the president was a guy by the name of Jeff Donnan. And Jeff was really keyed into things going on in the Reformed and Presbyterian world. He had all kinds of connections in all kinds of different churches. So he caught wind of this Auburn Avenue conference and this thing called Federal Vision. And he started sending me emails asking me about it and asking me what I thought about it, coming from my particular denominational background. So we didn't have the internet at home, but whenever we'd go to town, I'd collect my emails and then read them at home and then send replies the next time we came into town. Now, again, with this whole Federal Vision stuff, initially, I was open-minded to some aspects of what I was hearing. I wasn't on board with the post-millennial stuff, wasn't on board at all with the Pido Communion angle of it. But some of the other angles, I'm like, oh, okay, this sounds interesting. This sounds sort of like some things I've heard before. Well, I'm not sure where or how, but I began discussing Federal Vision with Dr. Scott Clark from Westminster Seminary in Escondido. Mm-hmm. Somehow we got connected. And Scott was really instrumental in helping me see that Federal Vision theology was a serious problem from a confessionally reformed perspective. Now, going back to Doug Wilson, since Doug Wilson eventually signed the joint Federal Vision statement, that meant that I was seeing that there were serious theological problems with him. And I wrote a booklet warning people in my denomination about Federal Vision. And when I wrote that booklet, I think it was called Federal Vision, a Canadian Reformed Pastor's Perspective, he was briefly mentioned in it. I didn't spend a lot of time on Doug Wilson, tended to spend a lot more time on the other guys, but he's certainly in there. Now, after my service as a missionary, I went on to serve a Reformed church in the Vancouver area in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. And that's where I started teaching apologetics to young people. And I was on the lookout for working illustrations of Reformed apologetics. Now, there was an article from Credenda Agenda called Rethinking Milk Buying by Douglas Jones. And I'd been using that article for the initial few times that I was teaching apologetics. I also tried to use the great debate between Greg Bahnsen and Gordon Stein, but it's a very long debate. It was on a cassette tape. It's really hard to get young people to listen to a philosophical debate for 3 hours. So besides this, this stuff, this article by Douglas Jones and this great debate with Greg Bahnsen, there wasn't a lot of stuff out there. So in 2009, when Doug Wilson did Collision with Christopher Hitchens, and I watched it, I was like, this is it. This is what I need. I was really impressed. Now, again, with Doug Wilson and how he did in Collision, how he spoke and expressed himself, again, I had some reservations. I wasn't totally on board with everything he said. He was crude at one point. His eschatology factored into some of the things that he was saying with Christopher Hitchens. And, so I recognize that you have to be still discerning with it. I'd always add a few words of explanation whenever I would show it. But I thought it was still a pretty decent illustration of how to do Reformed apologetics. So for a number of years, I used collision at the end of my apologetics training. I would do a whole section of theory, and then at the end, I would do the show that for the practical side of things, show collision. So I knew that Doug Wilson had some theological problems, also with federal vision, but I thought we could cut through the noise and still use them, particularly since no one else had come up with anything better up to that point. And then around 2013 or 2014, I became aware of a website called The Truth About Moscow. And I had a look at the documents there. I must have spent hours going through all the primary source documents that they had collected. And they were raising a lot of issues with Doug Wilson and Christchurch, especially around the matter of abuse. And that's something that's always really resonated with me. Try to be a strong advocate for victims of abuse. Part of that's my own family history. My mother was sexually abused as a child. It was part of, I think, what led her to take her own life in 2002. So, when I read this stuff about Doug Wilson and Christchurch, and how they were handling abuse cases, that really started to raise the alarm bells with me. But I wasn't sure about the source of these documents. I wasn't completely confident, that all this material was 100% legit, that it was all 100% reliable. Possibly there's another side to the story. I think it's important to try and be as fair as you possibly can. In my mind, I thought maybe this is just some individual who's got a vendetta or something like that. Maybe that's all this is. But I'm still my alarm level, my concern level is definitely rising as a result of this. But when the Examining Doug Wilson in Christchurch Facebook page started a few years after that, I think that was really the final straw for me. That's when I finally began to take those claims a lot more seriously, because now I was hearing a multitude of voices, right? People who had been in Christchurch, people who had saw the things that had gone down with the Sittler case and all the rest of that. And I could see that there was real substance behind the concerns over Doug Wilson. And now we're not just talking about theology, we're talking about the various abuse cases. And when he wrote a book about a sex robot, man, that was like, that finally did it for me. Like, I just like, what was he thinking? Like, how couldn't somebody say to him, Doug, this is not a good idea to write a book about a sex robot? But there he does. He went and he did it. And at that point, I was completely done with him. At that point, I concluded that anything good he might have to offer, whether it's on apologetics or whatever else, it doesn't outweigh the serious theological and other concerns that I have with him. So that's where I ended up.
Okay. So this is where your concern was raised to its highest level from the beginning of Auburn Avenue, and we'll be having more conversations with others about the Auburn Avenue conference and more recent happenings from those who were signers of the Federal Vision movement, who've had a history of saying, no, 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 we don't believe this anymore, but then have very, very, very recently said, no, this is exactly what we believe. And we do reject imputation of active righteousness. And we do reject the covenant of works, even though they won't say it as much, but this is still stuff that they do reject.
Right.
So now that all this stuff has come out and you have seen the light, as it were, and said, this is not something I can sign on to, not even something I could say like, oh, it's some good, some bad. It's like, no, I can't take any of this. What happened? What'd you do? What questions you start raising? You have a series of articles that kind of popped off. So what can you talk about what did you do when your ire was raised and your
Mhm.
antenna for horrible theology, abuse, everything else when that was raised?
Yeah, when I wrote my booklet about federal vision and Doug was mentioned in it, there was no response from anyone, which was kind of surprising to me. I thought that perhaps that might poke someone, but it didn't. And after that, I just dribbled out some little points about Doug Wilson from time to time on social media. But when I started sharing stuff from examining Doug Wilson in Christchurch, their Facebook page, there was a little bit of pushback from his supporters in my denomination back in Canada and a few others. And again, that was before COVID. So I think COVID really changed people's perspective on Doug Wilson. I think COVID really made him into, I don't know, not a martyr maybe, but more of a hero. Like he was the voice that was not in our own denomination, especially because, you know, a lot of the ministers, not all of them, but most of them took more of a pro-government approach to COVID, whereas Doug was a very anti-government approach, and some of these people they looked up to him for that. So I started sharing stuff from examining Doug Wilson Christchurch, and there's a little bit of pushback. Then after COVID, starting to get a little more pushback. Then I reviewed a couple of books related to Doug Wilson, and one was Crawford Gribben's
Mhm.
Survival and Resistance in Evangelical America, and Stephen Wolfe's The Case for Christian Nationalism, which was published by Canon Press. So I gave Gribben a pretty favorable review. I thought it was a very good survey of the issues in the Pacific Northwest, especially connecting Christian Reconstruction and what you see going on with Doug Wilson and Christchurch. But Wolfe's book, I definitely did not give a positive review. And I made sure to mention at the very beginning of that review that Doug Wilson thought it was a wonderful book. And well, he published it. So I imagine that he stands behind it. But in both those cases, again, when I published those reviews, they were first published in our denominational magazine back in Canada called Clarion. And then I published them on my blog as well. And again, there was really no pushback. I don't think anyone in his camp took notice. Then in mid 2023, I published a 3-part series on my blog. And the series was Doug Wilson, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So 3 parts, good, bad, ugly. And all my concerns were summarized in the last 2 parts. And that got the attention of his camp. I caught a lot of flack on social media for those blog posts. So some of his supporters, they tried to use let's call it the velvet glove approach. They invited me to come to Moscow at their expense, and I could meet with Doug, and I could talk about our differences, and we could have a really nice time schmoozing and schmaltzing with each other. I didn't even dignify that with a response. And then I met the iron fist inside that velvet glove. There were some people who got pretty abusive with me. I right away blocked them because I don't put up with that kind of stuff for very long. One of his supporters, a member of Christchurch, still regularly, even to this day, I think the last email I got from him was about 3 weeks ago, still regularly emails me to complain about my slander, that I have to repent and I have to see how I've done Doug Wilson wrong and everything I've said about him. And I don't know why he keeps writing to me because I never respond to him, but I guess he figures it's going to do something. Well, anyway, you got a mention on this podcast, so congratulations for that. And then last thing that was kind of interesting with the response that I got from those blog posts was that when examining Doug Wilson in Christchurch, got their letter from Doug's lawyers, the cease and desist letter, at least that's what it appeared to be. One of his supporters in Canada from my former denomination, from the Canadian Reformed Churches, wrote me a threatening email pointing out that letter and suggesting that I was going to be facing legal action as well. I just ignored him too. I didn't even bother to respond to that because really, the likelihood that someone in the United States is going to take legal action against someone living in Australia over something like this really doesn't seem to be worth the time, money, or effort. I'm a little fish. I'm not a big fish. I don't have this huge audience that some people do that like examining Doug Wilson in Christchurch. So I'm not worried about it.
Okay. I like this. This is what's funny now is it's I mean I hope it doesn't, but I mean likely it's it's gonna happen um that we'll all get more flack for this stuff after this whole series comes out. So yeah, maybe what I mean as a as a minister, seeing the stuff that Doug Wilson does as an ostensible minister and the reaction you get as a minister pointing out what another minister does that does not seem fitting of the office. What do you make of that? I think it's helpful having a pastor minister's perspective on another pastor minister who's speaking like this, whose followers react in the way they do. Maybe talk, and I know this is not in the list of questions I sent over, but I think it's just appropriate for this moment. Talk about like what is your perspective as a local church pastor on what is another local church pastor and the movement and the fury and the abuse behind him?
I think there's two main factors. Number one is the whole idea of celebrity pastors that exists broadly in American Christianity, and that spills over into other parts of the world as well. So Doug has become a sort of celebrity pastor, right? He gets the invites from John Piper, and I think Mark Driscoll at one point was involved with him, and so he was in that orbit. He had made it to the top, and I think as a result of that, he's developed a fanboy following. There are people. I remember this happening with Mark Driscoll too, back because I was a pastor in British Columbia in Vancouver, in the Vancouver area when Mark Driscoll was on the ascendancy, and I can remember having discussions with young people in our churches at that time, and I was raising concerns about Mark Driscoll and some of the things that he was saying, particularly about how he was once he was done with Mars Hill, there would be a line of corpses behind the bus, because if you're not going to get on the bus, you're going to be under the bus. And Mark Driscoll could do no wrong, and I see the same sort of phenomenon happening with Doug Wilson, because he's the celebrity pastor. It's almost like he's infallible. He's kind of become a Protestant pope, in a sense, for people. He's speaking ex cathedra, and whatever Doug says is the truth. And I think that's a very dangerous phenomenon for any pastor to be in. And I would, myself too, I'm not anywhere near being a celebrity pastor, and I'm quite happy with that. I don't need to be. I'm quite happy to just carry on doing ministry in my own local context here, and occasionally maybe doing some ministry elsewhere. But that whole phenomenon of celebrity pastors in American evangelicalism has been it's been a destructive force in a lot of different ways. Now, the other aspect I think of this is has to do with American culture. I'm an outsider. I can see things in American culture that Americans on the inside don't necessarily see. Some of you do, but not all. And it's just this kind of strident American can-do spirit. We're going to conquer the world, and nothing's going to stand in our way. And then when you combine that with a post-millennial eschatology, you get somebody like Doug Wilson. And there are people that are really attracted to that. They want to have hope. They want to have this idea that we are going to have a Christian town. We are going to have a Christian nation. We are going to be on top. But that whole way of thinking, in my mind, is contrary to what Luther called the theology of the cross. That we're called to suffer in this world. That's what we should be expecting. We shouldn't expect to be on top of the culture, on top of the government, on top of everything. if we're united to Christ, we should expect that it is, as Paul said, I think it's in Acts 14, it is through many tribulations that we must enter the kingdom of God. And I think many Reformed Christians have lost sight of that. I think their attraction to Christian nationalism, it combines this cultural phenomenon with an errant, not an inerrant, but an errant eschatology of postmillennialism, where everything is going to get better until we have a grand Christian golden age before the return of Christ.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to ask one more question before some concluding questions and your concluding thoughts as well. And I think this is helpful, especially since this is something that since from your mom, and if there's some information and some details that you don't want to get to, that's totally and completely fine. But I'm thinking too, at least in the Doug Wilson kind of Moscow context, we're living in this feminized world and everything's so driven towards women, and men are the ones who are kind of under the ire, they're under the judgment. Like, men can't do anything right. Women are the one who are doing all things right. And so like we gotta turn this script. And if that means some women get hurt, that means some women get hurt. It's not because we're abusing them necessarily. It's just they've been treated so well, and we gotta change it on them. So again, as a pastor, what's your I know this can get heated, but how would you speak to somebody whom may think this, like, the female submission under anything doesn't matter? You got to just take it. Maybe you earned it in some respect because, well, I don't, maybe you dress in a certain provocative way, or you spoke in a certain way, or you weren't submitting to your husband in a certain way, and your husband's right. Whatever your husband says, like, you gotta submit to it. Maybe talk as a pastor or those who might be thinking some of the same things that Doug Wilson and friends might be thinking about abuse in particular.
I just think of Jesus. I think of the gospel and the Christ who's revealed in the gospel. If we are really united to Christ, how can you talk like that? If we are Christ followers, if we're his disciples, how can we have that kind of a mentality that crushes people? That, we should be about flourishing for everybody, including women and children, the weak, the vulnerable. People can have this idea that, women have been on the up and up, and men are getting laid down into the dust and everything like that. That's not reality. Men still continue to have a much more stronger voice in our churches and in our society than women do. And the prevalence of domestic violence that exists out there in the world and also in the church is testimony to that. And the difficulty that women have in getting free from that out there in the world, and then even more so in the church, it's astonishing that anyone would talk like that. I can't imagine sitting across from our Lord Jesus Christ and hearing him say those kinds of things. I don't believe that he would have such a lack of compassion, that he would have such a lack of love for those who have suffered such horrible, horrible things. I think, God is on the side of the oppressed and the weak and the vulnerable. And the weightier matters of the law are mercy and justice. And those are the things that we as Christians ought to really be passionate about, that we should really care about. I'm always surprised that more people aren't advocating for abuse victims, and more people aren't advocating against domestic violence. And I don't understand. It tears me up. It breaks my heart that I often seem to be a lone voice in my circles.
Yeah.
And just in Reformed and Presbyterian circles in general, that there aren't more pastors who are willing to stand up and say, enough of this. Women are not objects. Women are human beings, they're fellow image bearers. We have to respect them. And we have to do what we can to protect them and to protect children as well. So yeah, I'd just bring it back to Christ all the time and think of the issue in terms of our union with him and our discipleship with him. How do those things shape this? And I think that too often that's what's really been missing from this conversation.
Yeah, a hearty amen for me on all of that stuff. It's, my goodness, if there's anybody who should be fighting for the uplifting of the oppressed, of, and not saying oppressed and women are the same thing, but of the oppressed, of women, of orphans, of children, of the poor, of domestic abuse victims, if it should be anybody, it's a freaking church who should be the ones who are on their side. And it's so often the opposite, that the church is like, well, I guess they deserved it. And it's like, are you kidding me?
Right.
Which that seems to be the message we get from the Doug Wilson camp for whatever reason. Maybe we'll have your 3-part series, your blogs, but also your booklet. And we'll have those linked in the show notes. Maybe if you can just summarize, like, what is the good, what is the bad, what is the ugly, and then we'll get into our concluding questions. So because this is a hit piece, to be sure, on Wilson, and we're trying to expose everything we possibly can on Wilson, but we also want to be fair and saying the stuff we agree on, but there's so much more stuff that we disagree on. So yeah, good. What we just summarize: good, bad, and the ugly on Wilson.
Well, as far as good is concerned, again, as a writer, as a communicator, sometimes he's really creative. He's witty. He's funny, and sometimes he goes a little too far. He's trying to emulate P.G. Wodehouse, and you cannot surpass P.G. Wodehouse. Maybe you can take some cues from him. You can, but you're not P.G. Wodehouse, Doug. But he does have his own gifts. I think the written word comes quickly and easily to him, and he could use those gifts in great ways for the kingdom of God if they were directed in the right way. So there's that aspect of his ministry that I think you can say something good about. There's also the fact that a lot of his political positions are correct. For example, he's anti-abortion. Well, so am I, absolutely. And I think that goes hand in hand with being against oppression and violence and caring about the weightier matters of the law, mercy and justice. That pro-life is included with that. So we're on the same page with regard to that. And broadly speaking, there's a kind of a Calvinistic direction in his theology. Whether he's actually consistent in carrying that through in every area of theology is another matter altogether. But at least on paper, he claims to be, to use a term that I'm not totally happy with, a 5-point Calvinist, right? So we'll give him that as well, even though the question of consistency is one that is legitimately raised as well. So I think those are some of the good things that we can speak about. And when it comes to the bad, in my blog post on the bad, I really went on about the theological issues that I have with him. And that would have to do with federal vision. That would have to do with the doctrine of justification. That would have to do with his eschatology, communion, all these sorts of things. Doug wants to be wearing the label Reformed, but in my mind, to be Reformed means that you hold to the Reformed confessions. And certainly on a point like communion, that is not in the Reformed confessions. And if you're holding to that, you've departed from the Reformed faith, at least on that one particular point. And I think the argument could be made, especially on the doctrine of justification too, that at the very least, Doug has been unclear on the doctrine of justification. I think there are instances where he has expressed himself in a most unfortunate way that would lead you to believe that he is heterodox in his teaching on justification. There are other places where he seems to correct himself and he seems to go in another direction. So it's sometimes really hard to tell where exactly he stands. Will the real Doug Wilson on justification please stand up? Sometimes we don't know. And I think for a Reformed minister to be unclear on such a vital doctrine is inexcusable, unacceptable. You should be able to make that abundantly clear at any time, especially the relation of good works to faith in justification. I think even a seminary student should be able to be clear on that, let alone somebody who's been serving as a pastor for numerous years. I think I heard on the other day since 1977 or something like that. 50
years.
Yeah, I mean, I was 4 years old when he started preaching. So, and then when it comes to the ugly really has to do with how these various abuse cases have been handled, or I should say mishandled in Christchurch and in Moscow. And the one that really gets under my skin is the Sittler case. A fixated pedophile, and he gets out of jail, and Doug officiates at his wedding. That if ever there was an example of pastoral malpractice, that is it. And I can't wrap my head around it. I can't understand how somebody could justify that. And I think even his own denomination didn't stand behind him for doing that. In addition to that, some of the lesser ugly things are, just some of the crude language that he uses around women in his writings. And again, his denomination called him out on that too. And I think that's completely inexcusable. I can't imagine that Christ would be looking at that and going, there's my servant. That's the way I would express it. I can't think that Jesus would use that kind of language to refer to human beings created in God's image. It's just appalling.
Yeah. So 2 concluding questions, and then concluding with your any thoughts you might have too. So I'm thinking of 2 groups throughout this series. The first group, which I think is probably the fastest growing, are those who are interested in this. Those who look at Wilson, like you said, they see his writings on the family. Maybe they've been introduced to him through his homeschool curriculum, the classical school system, through his writings on marriage, the less racy writings on marriage. So they see this and they're like, yeah, like with culture going amok and everything's up in flames, and the American election is like, who wants to vote for any one of these fools? They're like, what do we do? Like, this is the only sane voice we can find in the American church, and he's fighting the good fights. Maybe talk to them first, and again as a minister, but also as a person, on those who are interested in this movement. What would you tell them, and how would you counsel them about everything to do with Wilson?
I would tell them to do their research. And today, we're in a situation much different than we were 10 or 15 years ago. Today, the internet has given people a voice such as that they didn't have, even though the internet was around 10 or 15 years ago. Absolutely. But things have evolved in the way people use the internet to draw attention to issues and problems, and people have learned to use it to give themselves a voice. So do your research. Don't take my word for it. Don't take your word for it. Look at all the documentation that's out there. Look at the Truth About Moscow website. Look at the Examining Doug Wilson and Christchurch Facebook page. Dig, and dig deep. Don't just dig superficially. Go deep into the matters that are at stake here. And when people do that, I'm convinced that they'll reach the same conclusion that I have, that Doug Wilson is not what he seems to be. He's not a Reformed pastor. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Amen. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. The second group, for those who are in the movement, for those who've got a Series C pastor, or maybe Doug Wilson's their pastor, and maybe they're looking at the abuse cases, they're questioning theology, they're reading the Heidelberg, the Belgic, the Westminster Larger, Shorter, the Confession, they're reading Cans of Dort, and they're like, uh, I can't sign on to all this stuff. I'm here already, though. Maybe I'll just kind of throw away the bone, or throw away the meat and just eat the bones, or just we'll talk about this at home. We like him because he's fighting culture. He's fighting the good fight, but I'm just not sure. I'm seeing some of these abuse cases that are not being handled properly, but maybe they think, but it's we're trying to convince ourselves it's worth it to stay here. It's worth it to stay here because the fight that they're putting up. Maybe talk to them, and I'm maybe talk to them more as a minister. What would you tell them as a minister, as a reformed pastor, uh, holding to the reformed confessions? Talk to those who are in this crowd but questioning.
Yeah, at this point, I'm warning everyone I can about Doug Wilson, right? I'm taking off the gloves. We're not going to dilly dally around anymore. In my view, he is sub-reformed. And that makes him unreliable theologically. You can't be sure that what's going to come out of his mouth is going to be something edifying. You can't be sure that what's going to come out of his keyboard is going to be something edifying. He doesn't seem, I don't know if he has any accountability. If he has a system of accountability in place, it's pretty weak. Because I know if I were to say some of the things that Doug Wilson has said, if I were to write some of the things that he has written, my elders would be calling me up on the carpet about it. But he seems to be unaccountable to anyone. And that is a very dangerous situation to be in as a church member. When you have a pastor who does not have any apparent level of accountability, he can just about do anything. And everybody just has to live with it. So there's that. And, and there's also his profound lack of wisdom. His profound lack of wisdom in the way he expresses himself, sometimes even to the point of using unchristian language about women. How can you live with that? How can you be content to have a pastor who talks like that? How can you be content to have a pastor who's written a book about a sex robot filled with pornographic language? Like, you can't justify that. And finally, there's also just the profound lack of wisdom in pastoral matters. Like I mentioned before, I can't think of any justification for officiating at a wedding of a pedophile. And that's what Doug did in the case of Stephen Sittler. The facts are the facts. There's no getting around it. And Stephen Sittler got married, and then they had a baby together. And the baby was put at risk. And Doug bears responsibility for that. That is just so foolish. How could you want to be yourself in a church like that and have your family in a church like that with a pastor like that? You've got to have second thoughts about this.
Yeah, that's good. So maybe the end. Any final thoughts for those listening? We're assuming those who are listening are going to be wide audience, whatever kind of background, theological or not, they might have. We're also assuming Doug Wilson and friends are going to catch wind of this and listen, at least respond to it. So any final thoughts that you want to leave those who are listening with on this movements, and anything else I might have missed, or just what Wes Bredenhof himself wants to say?
I just want to express my hope and my prayer that things will change. that things will change with Doug and with Christchurch, and that there will be some honesty, some acknowledgement of how things have gone in the past, that they're wrong, that they've done wrong things, that they, instead of always taking this defensive stance where, everything that happened in the past is a-okay, we've never done anything wrong. Take some honesty and admit that, okay, we mishandled this. This was wrong. We shouldn't have done this. We have to do that in our own churches too. It's not that I'm looking down from this lofty tower down into the valley of unrighteousness, and there's Doug down at the bottom, and I'm way over here on the tower of righteousness. No, I'm saying all of us have to do that, and the Canadian Reformed churches have to do that. The Free Reformed churches of Australia have to do that. We've dropped the ball on some of these issues involving weak and vulnerable people so many times. And I think we need to have a conversation about that. We need to be honest about that and open about it, because that's the only way things are going to change. It's the only way things are going to start getting better. And I think if Doug were to do that, and if Christchurch were to do that, I think that would really, it wouldn't necessarily bring the people back who have left. It wouldn't necessarily heal all the wounds or anything like that, but it would be a huge step in the right direction. It would be a huge step in the right direction of being Christ-like. They call themselves Christ Church. Well, what would Christ do? What does he look like? Full of grace and mercy, full of grace and truth. That's our Savior, and let's reflect him.
So we've got our second Australian coming on the series after Wes Bredenhof, and she will be on the same episode as Wes Bredenhof. Wes will lead it off, and she will close it out. So if you can introduce yourself first and talk about the FRCA, the Free Reformed Church of Australia, the denomination, and talk about the culture and kind of how you got into it in the first place.
Okay. My name's Camille de Vos. I work as a biblical counselor and an artist. And yeah, like you said, I'm a member of the Free Reformed Churches of Australia. It's really hard to know how to talk about something that you're born into. I was born into the FRCA. My parents were born into the FRCA. So I know it's not normal at all, but it's my normal. So it's actually like when I was thinking about this, it's hard to know how to explain it to somebody who's from the outside, because you've always been on the inside. So my great-grandparents migrated to Australia with a whole lot of other people post World War II, and that was sort of how the FRCA was born. So they migrated late 40s, early 50s, a whole lot of different people, because the Netherlands was just completely ravaged from the war, and then they set up their own church. There was some theological reasons that meant that they weren't going to join any other church, like Reformed churches in the area. A recent split, which is called the Liberation, and I don't know the details of the theology as to why that was a split. Something to do with baptism. I was also
that's also a fair argument to have for anybody who's reformed, is anything on baptism.
it was also in 1944, which isn't in the middle of the war, or not the middle of the war, but the end of the war.
Yeah.
So you don't even know if it was a different different setting, if that would have even led to a church split.
Totally. Yeah. But if you have baptism there, like that's always going to lead to some sort of argument and some split in some church, no matter what time period it is. Is like you lift up baptism and then you watch them argue.
Yeah. Yeah, and it wasn't like should we do infant baptism? I don't know. It was really nuanced details in there somewhere. But I don't know what they were. But I think that has led to a very strong focus on doctrine, and a very strong emphasis on like almost maybe I don't like almost making a god out of doctrine. Like that's how heavily focused the community and the church has been on doctrine. And then like if you make a god out of something that isn't God, it comes at a cost to something else.
Mhm.
So it's a migrant community, very strong community, and very loyal to each other. There's different structures in there that are set up exclusively for the free reformed community. So school, aged care support, disability support, all these different or they're organizations, but they're set up as associations. So you can like if you're a member of the Free Reformed Church, you are somewhat expected to be a member of one of these associations so that you pay money towards the organization and support it as a membership. And then everyone so there's a big school for the community, but schooling is not like as a private school, as far as a private school goes, it's actually quite cheap to send your children to this private school because of how it's set up with the association. And it's also a very like it's quite exclusive, like no one else can access these services, but it's also like as a community and as a culture, like it's quite insular. Most people me, I grew up in this community. My parents grew up in this community. They met in this community. They married in this community. And most people also work within the community. You go to school in it. Like you don't get a lot of external interaction, especially unless you go out to seek it. Unless you purposefully make a point of interacting with people who are in different churches or your neighbors or in some way that you come across, like if you're in a workplace that isn't free reformed, then you can then your world might be a little bit bigger, but it's quite easy to have a world which has had very little interaction in terms of like solid relational interaction outside of the very free reform community. And yeah, most people work within the community and then will marry someone from the community and start their own family. And it's even taught that, well, the way the Lord grows his church is through having children and building a family. So it's a very like not sorry, brain's going into lots of different directions, but not like it's not taught that like the mission, there's not a big missional part to it. And there's more and more people who are growing in pushing towards a missional evangelical kind of approach to where the churches should be. But that's not always received well. You definitely hear from the pulpit like the FRCA is the only true church. There's no other true church. This is where it is. And you even hear and these are people who have no idea what they're talking about, but from the pulpit they're saying, "Oh, and this is what's wrong with the evangelical church," or "This is what's wrong with," and I've sat there sometimes thinking, well, actually, no, you have no idea. Most evangelical churches theologically line up with what we believe.
Yep.
But it's still just taught that this is this is the way. And then within that, there's also just a very strong patriarchal system. Just if you're a woman, your purpose is to marry and have children, to build the church, and you don't have a voice. And if you try to use your voice, they will just find ways to minimize what you're saying or dismiss what you're saying that sound good, because it leaves them comfortable. And it's a very tight community, but if you are an other in that community, if you don't fit a very specific mold, you are on the fringes. So there's a lot of free reform businesses. I was talking with my sister about this just as also a way to get my head into the right space. And she made the comment, she's like, I wonder if there's a lot of business owners because no one likes being told what to do.
Hmm.
Um, because that's also within it. But a lot of these, and it's not all of these businesses, and I can't tell you which businesses are on the in and which are not, but there's a lot of them that there's sort of this little boys club that they've made that they all scratch each other's back. And it's known that their business practices are not quite ethical. Um, but if you start to push against that, well, then you're going to lose the back scratching, because you're not scratching someone else's back. So there's this sort of very interesting culture there where a lot of these business owners then they are office bearers in church, they are elders or deacons, but they're a very different person on Sunday than they are when they enter the workplace on Monday. A lot of these businesses are in the trades, so they're cabinet makers, bricklayers, like there's a lot of cabinet makers actually. So but a lot of them are in a trade, for some reason. And so there's a lot of supporting each other, but only when you fit the mold. And if you don't fit the mold, you don't get the support. But also if you stick your head out in any way, there's incredible pushback. Yeah. And then I also like historically in the community, there's been some really horrible interpersonal disputes, but no one speaks about them. Like you just know, like I know of something that happened to my great grandfather where he was accused of really horrible, nasty things that weren't true, but he never spoke of them. He took them to his grave, and no one else really speaks of them. And I think those patterns repeat themselves because there's so much minimizing and dismissing and silencing in 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 all parts of interpersonal relationships. And then when you start paying attention to like anything relating to abuse, the pattern's all there already. Yeah. So that's mostly what I have about the community. I don't know if I've given a good explanation.
No,
Um,
that was phenomenal. The whole way you were describing it. Um, I mean, you could replace Australia or the Free Reformed Church of Australia with the CREC. Like
yeah.
it just sounded so similar, which is as you're
Oh,
describing this is like, am I sure Camille lives in Australia and not in Moscow, Idaho? Because this sounds exactly the same.
yeah. I have really had that like listening to different episodes on the CREC, and even when I first found out about Moscow through Sarah Stankov's book, Disobedient Women,
Mhm.
I went on the biggest rabbit hole because I was like,
Okay.
it's like copy and paste. Well, not quite. There's certain things like we don't have like say Christian nationalism or our racism's not as obvious. Um, but it still is um it's there's so many similarities and it really just took me on such a big rabbit hole when I first found out about the CREC and what it looked like. And I was like, what is this?
Yeah, yeah. That is incredibly interesting. So now that we've talked about both Moscow and the Free Reformed Church of Australia, which
Hmm.
those sound similar to me, and as you described this, how did you first come into contact with Doug Wilson? And not personally, obviously, but
Hmm.
through his
Hmm.
ideas or books or what may be.
Yeah. I I don't really know. I think it's always kind of he's been somebody that people read and access as a resource for a long time. I was talking like I found out recently my parents read his book on marriage 30 something years ago. And so I know it's there, and I know there's people whose families are structured off how he says you should run your family. run your family. I suppose that is how he talks.
Hmm.
Um, even though that's not how you should have a family. Um, and his books, I think, like if you looked at the bookshelves of a free reformed person, it's very likely that there would be some of his books on their shelf. Um, and all of those similarities, they're there. But I can't tell you, like it's sort of like it's in the walls, it's in the culture. So I can't tell you what influences are there outside of, but then I'm also someone who doesn't pay attention to names. So until I was sort of on this rabbit hole and figuring out all these things and seeing the patterns and seeing the similarities, I could have heard his name beforehand. I could have heard about the CREC before, like a year or two ago, but not pieced it together.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and that's very similar to other stories we've received. Um, you when you read it, you're like, huh, this sounds like what I'm already in, and this sounds like the denomination I'm already in. It sounds like a lot of the pastors that
Mm,
I've interacted
mm,
with, and a lot of the people that I've already. So it's not so much that he is so unique. It's um he, and which is what we've learned throughout the series too. It's he he's just parroting maybe more concisely what is already in the water in the modern
yeah,
church.
yeah, no. Because there is definitely like before he became big, so these patterns were already there in like definitely in the free reform churches, but I think elsewhere too.
Yep. Yep.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
just part of who Doug Wilson is, I suppose. He has also then, like you say, parroting that, like that's part of how he has used that to grow his influence.
Yeah. Yeah. You described yourself as a biblical counselor, and I
Hmm.
think when people listen to this series, their first gut response is like, "Oh, you're one of those people, a biblical
Yes.
counselor." But I think also you have had the same experience
Hmm.
within biblical counseling. We're going to talk a little bit later on about some of the differences that you have with the biblical counseling movement and your unique perspective on this, which I think is really helpful. But a lot of your story comes from inside the biblical counseling
Yeah.
movement, especially so in Australia and its kind of American branch, because you've talked about
Hmm.
pre-recording, we've talked about some differences between
Yeah.
American biblical counseling and Australian biblical counseling. So what was the workplace like that you were at?
Hmm.
Because this is a lot of
Hmm.
where your story revolves around
Yeah.
is being in these environments.
Yeah. So biblical counseling in Australia is actually quite young. Like I don't think we could call it a movement yet.
Hmm.
Um, there's not a lot of people who are biblical counselors, especially in Perth. I don't know if you know the geography of Australia very well. Perth is
I'm
this
your
city
average
on the
American who
west.
knows very little outside of America.
Perth is this little city on the west coast. It's the only like significant city in a very big state. Um, which is full of mining and everything, but it's quite isolated from, like, it's one of the most isolated cities in the world.
Huh. Okay.
So when I first started in the biblical counseling space, I was not aware of other biblical counselors in the same city as me. So I think my experiences, they are in biblical counseling, but they're also very strongly a reflection of like what it is like to work in the free from community, and for one of those workplaces as well, like sort of together. So I was working for an organization that was one of the associations I was talking about before.
Yep.
And so I think I mentioned like qualification for membership for these associations is that you're a member of the Free Reformed churches.
Yep.
And eligibility to be a member on the board is the same. Like you don't need any sort of extra understanding of how boards work or extra training. I mean, they typically will ask someone who maybe seems to have some more business expertise or some sort of expertise in some sort of leadership. Um, but
Yeah.
that's about
Hopefully.
it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Oh, hopefully, definitely, hopefully. And then this organization was much younger than a lot of the other associations as well. So was actually a lot less
Yeah,
people
they
who
just needed
were.
warm bodies on the board
Yeah,
instead of
yeah,
people who had a lot of experience.
yeah, no, no, that's definitely true. And to start with, um, the relationship I had with the board, there was trust. There was a trusting relationship. They were aware of their limitations
Mm.
and let me, like, we had a good relationship, which was very collaborative, but also trusted that I knew what I was talking about and knew what was best for the organization and for the free reform community, because the organization was set up exclusively for the free reform community. But I think I'd been there for about 4 years. And then there was a big change in the board. I think there was like 3 or 4 new people. So it was a really big shift. So about half the board changed. And that then that relationship really, really changed. Very different people, um, and very different ways of doing things, which then moved that relationship from a relationship of trust into one, like, more and more of one of control. And I didn't really notice this straight away. It was much more sort of just shifting sands or shifting expectations or not knowing where I stood, or would have a conversation with somebody on the board about something and then sit there in a board meeting and be sidelined because they disagree, like they were agreeing with me when we're having that conversation one-on-one, or and then in a board meeting they're saying something completely different. So that's sort of where it started. And I am, like, it's in my nature to speak out. So I was pushing back, but I don't know if that, I probably didn't do it well all the time. And pushing back didn't help me at all. It made it worse. Um, and then it was a lot of those sort of shifting things, and I was noticing more and more, like, they wanted more say over what I was doing. Like, I was definitely, like, they had oversight and they needed oversight, but this was getting into the nitty-gritty of what I was doing or how I was spending my days, or it was turning into like micromanagement. Um, and over time it was becoming more and more obvious. And then I think the biggest shift for me in that was, this was probably only like 6, 7 months in of the changes in the board. I had this like almost surprise performance review, and I, I'd been asking for some, like, for, because of those shifting sands, I'd been asking for clearer expectations, clearer direction, because that would give me structure to work within. But this performance review had nothing to do with the work that I was doing, and actually felt much more like a character attack. It seemed to be much more focused on the fact that I wasn't always in my office at 9 a.m. or that I wasn't organized in the way that they thought I should be organized. And a lot of different things that just, to me, felt like peripheral different things, and it actually also felt like, this is the box that you want me to be in, and I'm not inside your box. It doesn't take away from how I'm doing my work or what I'm doing with my work, but I'm not in your box. And then I pushed back on that after I left the performance review, just sort of, my head was spinning because I prepared, and I didn't even have the opportunity to ask for or speak about the areas where I thought I needed support. And so I pushed back. I asked for another meeting, which was very stressful, but also the people involved were very stressed, as well, because they were aware of the pushback. And then that sort of did give me more of an opportunity to speak, because at the time too, I was the only person working for this organization. So I was outside of these shifting sands and all these things going on. I just was stretched to capacity with my workload for the hours that I kept. So some of that, then their response was to put structures in place so that I was better at managing my time, which I have a very chaotic brain. I have structures that work for me, but they don't work for everyone else. Like that's just, it doesn't stop me from achieving. It doesn't stop me from,
You're a unique human being who has her own structures, just like I have
yeah,
my own structures.
yeah, exactly. And I didn't work with what they wanted. Um, so there was a lot of tension in all of that. Um, and then it was probably a little bit later, I took what I saw as initiative and had a lot of reasoning and rationale to back myself up um, to like, so a lot of the work that I was doing was running like training programs and connecting people like in churches. Like I wasn't doing lots of counseling, but running programs and stuff. And I wrote my own program based off what I saw and a need. And there was an incredibly uncomfortable reaction from the board. And then they wanted to put a lot more structures in place to so that they would be checking in, not in a governance, making sure everything's going right or helping me with reporting or anything like that, but in a we need control kind of way. And it was really frustrating because I couldn't work like that, but also just really like unsettling because I would all at this point too, there was one of the board members who he worked kind of close to where my office was. So sometimes in his lunch break, he would just come visit and say hi, which that was unsettling as it was. And I remember one conversation with him, and I was sitting there and I was sort of trying to understand why they wanted what they wanted from me, like in terms of how much, because it like was asking me to do a whole lot of extra work so that they could have the check-ins that they wanted and the control that they wanted. And I remember sitting there and I was trying to understand it because if I can understand it, then I can work with it. But I couldn't understand it. And I asked this board member, and then his response to me was, "Oh, Camille, if I have a daughter and she travels across Australia, I need to know where she is and who she's with and what she's doing at every single point in time." And that was really eye-opening to me, like really eye-opening, because I was sort of sitting there thinking, what? Um, what? I, yeah. I've traveled a lot, and half the time my travels is, oh, that's my return flight home. The updates that my family gets is, I will, I'm here. Look at this pretty thing. Look at this nice thing. I did this. That's the way that I thought it would be. And this incredibly controlling response just it was really eye-opening as well, because it told me a lot about how the board saw me. And I think they saw me more as one of their daughters than somebody who was working with them and had expertise and yeah, in what I was doing and knew what I was doing and experience. I wasn't that young then either. Not that age really mattered, I don't think. Um, and it was around this time that I was asking for more support, but then, and I was giving them requests for what I needed support in, but they had a big idea for something completely different. And I remember pushing back against that and clearly articulating myself in the ways that their ideas were not financially viable, not great for the organization, not great for the people that we're wanting to work with. Just like multiple points of view. And then the response being, oh, you're really good at seeing things from lots of points of view. And nothing. Like, and so, yeah, this was all going on. And then there was a couple female members on the board, like bums on seats, like you said before, I think. And one of them, we had a bit of a relationship, and I remember her meeting with me through all of this, and just sitting there, just like, well, why don't you do what they're asking? Just do it, just do it. And there was very much a trying to keep the peace. And I couldn't say it to her then, but I didn't want to play their games. I didn't want to go with it because it wasn't good. I just didn't have all of the words that I needed at the time to express that, probably even to myself, as well. Yeah, I ended up taking like 6 weeks off, and I painted a really, really big mural with one of my closest friends, and it was just this beautiful reset and a reconnection with myself and a reconnection with God. And it gave me a lot of clarity. But it also helped me to see that I wasn't just burnt out. Because if it was just burnout, 6 weeks doing that would have been a really good reset and way to start again. But I really could see that in the ways that they were trying to do things and the ways that were responding to things, I didn't have a voice. I couldn't use my voice. And I was getting to a point, like I remember using resources that I have to support women in abusive relationships for myself, so that I had a exit strategy or a back out. Like if I was going to get a surprise visit because they were happening more and more, that I could just go out the back door because my car was parked at the back of the office and they would come in the front. And those sorts of things. But also using those same resources to help me in conversations that I was having. But then also I was getting, because I had more clarity, and I wasn't ready to leave. Like sometimes I think you just have to, like with anything like this, the stepping out of it, I don't know, it comes at your own time. And I wasn't there yet. I wanted to push. I think I wanted to fight more. Right or wrong, I think it was wrong, but I still I still wanted to fight. But in that, as I pushed back more and more and stood my own ground, I could see this increasing frustration. Even had that frustration expressed at me in different ways. And the biggest thing, as I was like sitting with all of this, I realized I knew in the free reform community, which is the community that this organization was set up to work for and serve. I knew that there was so much abuse in different ways and different shapes. But I was not safe myself in this workplace. So there was no way that there was safety or protection to be able to do the work that I knew was really important. And I just got to a point, I can't even remember what happened, but I was like, no, that's it. And I handed in my 4 weeks notice. I was at a point that I was sort of planning an exit, and then there's something happened. I can't remember, I can't tell you what the something was. There's a lot of very specific, clear memories combined with fuzz from this whole time, which I think is part of the stress and the like shows the stress and the trauma that was going on. And yeah, there's something that was it. I just was like, no, this is it. I'm not gonna I'm out.
Yeah, thanks for telling that story. So you left that practice and its
Hmm.
association with the Free Reformed Church of Australia. I almost said Free Reformed Church of America, Free Reformed Church of Australia. Um, and then you eventually, so you talked about why you left it,
Hmm.
and then you found your own practice. And I think
Yes.
that that might shock people. Like you were hurt in the biblical counseling movement, at least under some leaders
Hmm.
who practiced this and who promoted it and who were administrators of it. And you founded your own. I think some people were like, if that happened to me, I would leave everything. I would leave the entire thing because
Hmm.
it holds some weight for them. And to each their own how they process this. And you processed it by founding your own practice. So
Yes.
can you talk about finding your or founding your own practice, starting your own practice, and how you differentiate it from not just your training, but in the environments that you've been in before, and then not in reaction to, but um, helping those who have been hurt by some of these institutions too. So if you talk about your own practice and how you found
Yeah.
it.
Um, so I think I slowly was was as I was making my exit plan and thinking about it. I mean, obviously there was like a definitive I'm done, but I was already starting to give that shape. Because another part of the control and demands was um that I couldn't counsel or see or engage with, like in my work, engage with anyone who was not from the FRCA. Um, and the layers of hurt in this community, and I have so much love for all of that and so much compassion, but the layers of hurt to be working in that all the time and then to be sitting in that for church and to be completely surrounded by that, I think I would have suffocated and then definitely taken the exit strategy of just nope, I'm done, out. Um, so that was I already had I think two clients that I was seeing without the board's knowledge on the side. They weren't very reformed,
Mhm.
and they would I would um, and I had at this point connected with two biblical counselors in Perth, and we would meet regularly. And one of them has been practicing for a while, and the other one I met. We did our master's degree together, so we met um, online because we both did our master's degree in through CCEF and Westminster, Philadelphia. Um, so we would connect, and so I was aware of the need through these counselors. But also the board was very precious over like they were but I think they felt threatened by my engagement with people who weren't pre-reformed. Um, so I think already then there was a slow I had access to setting at my own practice. And I think that well part of it was I knew something needed to be happening to address abuse in all of the shapes and forms that it's happening in the free from churches. Um, but I think it's very much God just put the right people in my life so that it, I was able to take that and shape it into something else instead of being too burnt to stay. I think that's the only way that I can say that that happened. And maybe as well through that and through the grace of God, I had clarity over, well, this isn't right. Like the way that they're wanting to do things or the way that this is happening, it's not right. It's not good. It's not biblical, even though it's been called biblical. Um, and and I can do it right. By the grace of God, I can do it right. Like not any sort of I'm so good,
Mhm.
but in a way that And I think there was this huge part of me that was just, no, this is needed.
Mhm.
This, like, the free reformed community needs this. They need to know that there is a place that is not connected to the system, that gives you an opportunity to talk about the system, but also the difference that I have as opposed to these other biblical counselors is I know what their normal is, so I can help them give voice and expression to their normal. Because I think I said this before, like when you're inside it all, you don't know that your normal is not normal. But then if you have that space to untangle, okay, this is my normal, but it's not normal, and I can untangle this a bit, and then also see this is what God says about what is right.
Yep.
I think that just is what shaped and led me to doing what I do.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, the normal is not normal. There's two people I'm thinking of, and I actually I think this is in the Patriarchy episode. It's episode, those who are listening, I think it was episode 13, 12, 12 or 13, one of those two. We have a lot of episodes, and so it's one of those two.
Yes.
But it's I quote from Charles Taylor, his Modern Social Imaginaries. He's a Canadian philosopher, and his Modern Social Imaginaries is all about like you don't notice your culture until you walk outside of your culture.
Mm.
Then David Foster Wallace, who's a famous author, I just finished his book Infinite Jest, and he has a famous commencement speech at Kenyon College in 2005 or six, and he like you just said, the normal is not normal. He talks about two fish who were swimming in the water, and then an
Mm.
old fish comes in the opposite way, passes by them, and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the two fish, after swimming by a little bit, say, "What the hell is water?" It's you're so used to the waters that you swim in that you don't notice that the
Yeah.
waters that you swim in, and you don't notice that your normal is not normal. It's like that's your culture. This is your
Yeah.
specific culture. And when you compare it to other cultures, doesn't mean your culture is bad or their culture is good or their culture is bad and your culture is good. It just
Mm.
means you don't notice
Yeah.
until you look outside. And
Yeah.
from what you're saying from FRCA, and we notice that from a lot of American denominations, we don't notice that some of our denominational practices are really unhealthy until we look
Yeah.
outside of the denominational practices and notice, oh, those are really unhealthy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and it's when you start to take that step outside that you start to realize, I think it's only recently that I've been able to say, no, this is a high control environment.
Hmm.
And it's taken a big step out and sideways to be, no, that is what it is. And that shapes so many of the things that you do. It's not the Bible that is shaping that. That is a need for control or desire for control.
Yeah. Yeah. The Bible is the thing that gives us freedom in Christ, not control in
Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So you don't have to get into these specific stories, and these are their stories
mhm.
to tell.
Yeah.
But you are aware of stories within individual congregations of the FRCA. Um, so without getting specific, what are maybe some of the like the themes that you've seen or some of
Mhm.
the stories that are shared across some of these? And how, maybe more specifically, how churches tend to respond
Yeah.
within the
Yeah.
FRCA to reports of abuse. So, what have you seen without getting specific about their case? And this is their
Yeah.
story to tell. And then how are churches known to respond?
I think I've definitely seen, like, there's so many echoes in the stories that have been profiled so far to those that I have seen and witnessed. Um, I think a very big one is like a very big theme is marital rape. That's like I have a friend who has told me that she is so thankful that the intimacy in her marriage is mutual, that if she's not interested, her husband isn't interested. And she's so thankful that this is the case.
Hmm.
Um, I'm also very thankful
Yeah,
that she
everybody
is
should be
safe in her
thankful for that.
marriage.
But the fact that you're thankful for it, like you said, like that shouldn't be normal that you're thankful. That should just
Yeah,
be the way marriage is.
yeah, yeah. Like you're thankful for the bare minimum.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
um, and that so that is it's very normalized. I was engaging with a minister and his wife about something, and they too were telling me, no, you have to realize this is normal. And it was again along the lines of marital rape. Um, and it's yeah, that I think hearing that out of the mouth of a minister, it that did something for me. Like I think it drove me towards, no, something needs to change. Like I was already sitting in that, but hearing those words was like, no, this is so, so wrong. Um,
So the minister was
and
saying, "Hey, this is pretty normal
yeah,
in our
yeah,
denomination and among marriages in our denomination,
yeah,
like the man forcing himself on his wife."
yeah, yeah. And yeah,
Was
like
he?
I
I mean, you can't get into his intentions or his like maybe his emotion, but did he just say it like matter of factly? Is like, yeah, that's just what happens here.
a little bit. I was advocating for someone, um, and there was multiple things going on, and part of it was this,
Yeah.
and it's like, no, you got to realize this is normal. And
Huh.
I honestly, I can't remember much more of the conversation because I was that angry. Like I hopped in my car and it was like a 20-minute drive to my house and I cried the whole way. Not just for the person I was advocating for, but the like and hot angry tears. Like this is not okay. Um, it's not okay.
No, not at all. And the
And
fact that
there's
he just says it like, yeah, that's just what happens here, as
yeah,
if you shouldn't do something about this for your own
yeah,
congregation. If you know this is happening, yeah, why aren't you calling the cops, calling the husband, figuring
mm.
something out and helping these women out?
Yeah, I ended up responding in an email when I had a clearer head and saying, no, this is illegal.
Yeah,
This is illegal and we have to treat it as such. Um, I think I found a way to say I was very distressed to hear that. And if that's happening more often, like not to make it about what he said, because that would have been a little bit too aggressive, maybe. I don't know. I can't remember exactly what I said, but yeah, this it's we need, like you say, you need to involve the police. You need to um do something about it because it's not okay.
yeah,
Even again, like the conversation we're just having about what's normal.
yeah. It's still rape, even if it's husband and wife.
Well, yeah, consent isn't given when you say I do.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there's like within the FRC, like that's definitely like obviously there's some sort of normalcy in normal like a lot of people I think are experiencing this in their marriages. Um, but there's also so many women I know that outside of marriage as well have stories of assault
Yeah,
and sexual abuse and rape. Like young girls in the family context with brothers or fathers or uncles or some other family member. Um, and some of it's once-off experiences, others it's an ongoing thing. Teenagers just, being groped at school or at a party or anything like that. Or with in what they thought was just a mutual, like a friendship, when whatever the relationships you are, that you have when you're 14, 15. But then it becomes something more, or then as they get older, going on a date and being pushed well beyond what they were comfortable with. And then definitely within that, also, yeah, being raped. And I think for some of them, they would stay in that relationship because you kind of taught, and then if you add in the teachings of purity culture on top of that, that it's your fault. If you know, especially if it's as an in your late teens, early 20s, and that happens. So then you try and make it right by staying. So that's something that seems to be everywhere. I can't tell you statistics, and I know that my perspective on this is probably not the most objective. But then I think I also am in a position where people, like not just in the counselling office, but in the relationships I have, or the way relationships I build and the connections I build, that I am somebody people can open up to. And it feels like it's everywhere you look. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
Keep going. Sorry.
Oh, I was sort of just going to wrap it up. I think that's the biggest thing of what I've seen, on top of definitely like high control families, very, very prescriptive about what it means to be a member of that family, even towards adult children, like as they grow, you know, and start their own families, but that control is still there. And from the outside, I don't know, I'm not aware of as many stories of like child abuse and that kind of thing. It's there. I know it's there. And you can look at the way people, like parents, behave to their children, or fathers especially behave to their children, that you definitely, like, I think being in the space that I am and the training that I have, you notice patterns of behavior that make you think, oh, that's not good. Um, so yeah. Yeah. And in Australia, I was looking at statistics a week ago, but Australia has a serious problem with domestic violence. The intimate partner homicide rates have doubled, more than doubled, since 2021. And to be naive enough to think that the FRC is immune to that, I think the fact that you even begin to think that you're immune means that there are some really, really profound secrets. Because another thing within insular high control environments, it breeds secrets, because you can fall into a pattern of behavior and there's not a lot of external influence. So something looks normal, but you can also hide a lot. And definitely within the FRC, like, people don't have deep relationships. Like, I think the environment and the history and the traumas and the intergenerational traumas, there's this lack of relational and spiritual vitality, which means as well that there's so much more opportunity for secrets, because no one's going to know, because you don't really enter into each other's lives. Yeah. And so, like, when it comes to the church's response in so many of these things, because so much of these abusive behaviors look like the culture, they don't really do anything. Sometimes you wonder if office bearers are hearing these stories, but it confronts them about their own behaviors.
Yeah.
And then if you add in, like, narcissistic type of people and their behaviors, they're really good at playing the system. And when you have such a structured system, it's an easier system to play. And they say what's good. They say what they need to say to get the office bearers on their side. and they can be years. I know stories where there's years of them playing the game in the right way and not being held to account. In the meantime, there's so much pressure on the wife, who has finally been brave enough to step away and say, no, we need space because this is not right and this is not safe for both of us, and for the sake of both of our souls, we need this space. But then they are under so much pressure to stay, or so much pressure to return, because there's not a recognition of what is actually going on. And also the people who are having the courage to speak about the abuse that they're experiencing, they're not believed. Like, it can't be that bad. Or, I don't know, there's just so much dismissal and minimizing of what people are saying, or normalizing. Yeah. And I say this, and I also know of encouraging stories as well, or changes in, like, the elders who are involved, and then you have one who can see the games that are being played and can call someone out, or so it's not, there is glimmers of light and hope in the mix of it all, which I do find very encouraging, because sometimes it feels like you're just pushing up against a gigantic wall.
Yep. Yeah. As one of our guests has said, Lena Sutherland, that the system works puts more pressure on when it doesn't work. And it so often doesn't work, but the fact that it can work
Yeah.
means there's much more judgment when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the glimmers of hope put even more pressure on those who fail the
Yeah.
system.
Yeah. Yeah. There is one story-ish that I can share because it's public.
Okay, sure.
And I can talk about, well, so I'll just tell the story. Um, I can't remember the timeline, but one of the organizations in the Free Reform Church, like associations, is one that's set up to support people with a disability. And a support worker at that organization, I believe he handed himself in and confessed to 12 accounts of rape of somebody in his care. And initially, so he handed himself in, and initially then his church banded around him and supported him. And because he confessed, he handed himself into the police, he was out on bail, but very supported by the church community. And throughout his court case, a few people who, like his elder and a few friends from the church who were supporting him, they were there all the time. They wrote character testimonies, attesting to who he is. And throughout the court case, he ended up getting a diagnosis of autism, which meant that his sentence did not include jail time. So it seems that, and this is from the engagement that I've had with different people from the congregation that this man is in. Where was I going? Sorry. It seems that his autism became like a reason as to why he didn't understand what he was doing, or didn't understand the rules around why what he did was so incredibly wrong. And so the church really wrapped around him, tried to explain why what he did was wrong, tried to really encourage him. But this has been now drawn out over a significant amount of time, and there is a good amount of people in that congregation who see this man, see the way that he's present in church, the way that he engages or tries to engage with the congregation. And there's a lot of behaviors that suggest that there is a lack of genuine repentance or remorse. And I know of a number of really well thought out letters that have been like written to church, like the church consistory, raising a lot of those concerns, and their discomfort and what they're seeing. But what ends up happening is the office bearers come back and they say enough to silence or minimize those concerns, and nothing changes. Which then the way that they have been handling this, and they do, there's some admittance of, yeah, we haven't done everything great, but no change. And the way that it's handled is just sort of, and it just sort of keeps like stays the same, and the church ends up hurting so much because of the presence of this, what seems to be like, it seems to be like rotting in the church because nothing's been done. And that is, like, I can tell that story because it is much bigger and much more public. But I think it's a good example of how things are handled, even when they're not as public, in the way that they are minimized or silenced, or the congregation isn't made to be as aware as they should about what is going on, or the types of people that are attending church, and there's seems to be no awareness or thought towards the safety of the congregation and how to love and protect and nurture them well.
Second to last question before we conclude, and I do want you to shamelessly plug your counseling practice and some of the stuff that you do. And
Okay.
a lot of it has to do with, like, you are critical of American biblical counseling. Like you said, Australian biblical counseling is new, and you said not even really a movement yet because it's so new.
Yeah.
But you have a unique, even in our first call, you have a unique and I think a pretty refreshing take that's holistic, but also, and it sounds trite, but I want you to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Grace-based counseling. Because I think Americans, I will say, when they think, if you know what biblical counseling is, which is a very small subset
Mm.
of counseling in general, you think of nouthetic, which is like you just pound you with your sin and say everything's
Yeah.
about sin, and we got to figure out your sin. When you figure out your sin, and when you finally repent, you'll get better.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it's like bruising counseling. The more
Yeah.
bruised you come out of it, the better you come out of it. So can you talk about your quibbles with American biblical counseling, your own practice, and how you approach it?
Yeah. Um,
And please plug
I
your
think
counseling practice. I know you're very shy around plugging it, but please plug it.
okay. Um, I think I want to start by just saying, like, the stories I've heard where people have been counseled so wrongly through the podcast, like, it just breaks my heart. I'm really sorry for those who've had that experience. I'm sorry for those who were listening and I haven't heard their story, but it, like, that they have been bruised and bashed. Because that is not the love of Christ in any way, um, at all. So yeah, I think there's that nouthetic brand of counseling where these counselors think that speaking the truth means that you are loving. Based off Ephesians 4:15-16, like speaking the truth in love. And they take I'm speaking the truth, so therefore I must be loving. But if we speak the truth without love, we are not speaking the truth. In the same way that if we speak love without the truth, we're not loving. And there's a lot of that very much focused on like sin-focused approach, that it's not really truthful anymore. It misses the heart of Christ, and that like and as biblical counselors, I think anyone in ministry, you are called to follow Christ and bring the heart of Christ to the people you minister to. And you know, Isaiah talks about Jesus being the counselor or the wonderful counselor, depending on your translation. And he had so much love and compassion and care for those who are hurting. And the only people that he ever called out or attacked because of their sins were the hyper-religious and the hypocrites and the Pharisees. Like, they're the people that he called brood of vipers. He didn't call, didn't even do it like the woman who was caught in adultery. He showed love to her and compassion and mercy. And that is what biblical counseling should be. That is what the Bible teaches us about what counseling should be. There's so much comfort and grace and love for the people who suffer, and also for the sinner in Scripture. Like, that's what the gospel is about. It's not about us figuring out our sins and then having a better life. Like, that turns into a twisted form of prosperity gospel. And we all know, as Reformed Christians, prosperity gospel is wrong. But somehow we make that out, we take a version of that, and that's how we live our lives. Like, our practical theology is actually somewhat prosperity gospel based. It's not, which is wrong. I think, and I'm not in America, so I can't speak about everything that's happening, but it's sitting on the sidelines over here.
You actually have a better perspective than I do, because I'm in the waters and you're not.
Yeah. See, this is a different take on what's normal and what's not.
Yeah.
It seems that there is this increasing divide in the biblical counseling movement in America. That there is more and more of that. And look, both sides will argue that their approach is what's biblical. But there's that more nouthetic J. Adams, find the sin, and if you find the sin, it's right approach, as well as then the CCEF approach, which is more Ed Welsh, Dave Pallison, although he's passed away now, approach, which then it takes it takes more of that holistic approach to, well, yeah, you are a sinner, but you're also a child of God, and you also are living in a broken and sinful world. So you not only sin, but you are sinned against, and you experience the brokenness, and you come face to face with that brokenness and the suffering. And when you have that bigger picture understanding, then the way that you would counsel that is much more, let's find God in this, and his love for you, and his comfort, and the way that he gives you a refuge for this. Let's look to God and see his heart, and the heart, like if you think about counseling in the context of abuse as well, God has such a heart for those who are vulnerable and weak and oppressed. He has such a love for that. Like, there's so many different scriptures that speak about justice, speak against oppression, and oppression is a very, I really like that, and as a term that reflects, like, as a biblical term that reflects abuse. And there's so much that of scripture that speaks to that, and can find comfort and hope through that. That then it isn't about the sin, because Jesus took all of that sin. And I think, and this is where that more nouthetic approach I'm gonna say it, but it might sound really harsh. They don't see the person in front of them always.
Yeah.
Because so many people, especially those who have been abused in some way, they know their sin. They know where they're not measuring up. And I think if you've been abused in some way, if you've been a part of some sort of high control environment, like you know how you're not meeting the standard.
That's all you're ever told. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
you're never told how great of a person, how much you're contributing to this environment. You're always told like, hey, you're not doing very well this week. Hey, you're not doing well this week. Hey, you're doing worse this week.
Yeah,
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 it's how little you measure up. And so when they come to counseling office and then the counselor says the same thing, you're like,
yeah.
I can't win.
Mm, mm. And that's not what counseling should be about, because they come in knowing how they don't measure up, and they actually need to know how they do measure up, how they are created in the image of God, and how in Christ that they measure up perfectly, and what that looks like. And then that's what they need to hear, not these are all of your sins and you need to do something about this, because we are all sinners and we all need the grace of God. So let's find that grace together. So a big part of my approach to counseling is then, well, let's focus on your relationship with God. Let's find God in that pain, because he promises that he is there, and hold on to that promise and grow in relationship with him. And then everything else falls around that. It doesn't mean it's going to be neat. Doesn't mean it's going to fit back into the system. Um, in fact, sometimes as you grow in relationship with God, you fit into the system less, because what's most important then becomes, I need to serve God, and serving God means saying no to being sinned against. Serving God means standing up for myself and not allowing someone else to treat me as less than or anything like that. And it gets messy, I think, when we are focused on that relationship with God instead of that neat, well, this is wrong, this is how you fix it. But people aren't neat. People aren't, we're not boxes. We don't fit into boxes. We need, it is messy. And I think heart-focused, grace-focused biblical counseling is counseling that is willing to get really, really messy. There's a quote that stuck with me from my, like when I was doing my studies, from Ed Welsh, and I think there's one course that he just, as a lecturer, he said over and over, and it was humility and love, and that's your methodology. And I think when you come to people with humility, especially in this context, especially humility, but also love, and that heart of Christ, then that means that you're not going to be bashing them and bruising them because of the sins that you see. And I think as well, humility also means that you have the opportunity and the space and the teachability to see that your framework for the world might not be the right one, or it might need to change. Like your worldview, I suppose,
Yeah,
might
at
need to
least not the
change. You might
only
need to
framework
shift.
too. Yeah, there's other
Yeah,
frameworks out there.
yeah, yeah. Um, and it also gives you the opportunity to see that there's places that it doesn't fit with scripture, and it needs to change there. Um, yeah. I could probably keep talking about this, um, because it's something I feel really strongly about, especially about having compassion. I think if you lose compassion, you're not gonna be able to, you can't meet anyone where they're at. And compassion also gives you the opportunity to see and understand and hold on to the impact of the way that trauma just really messes with your body. And it sticks with you, and the ways that you can't just be like, oh yeah, that was pretty horrible. Let's move on. It's there and it stays and it changes who you are, but it also changes you physiologically. And you can really, and that's where so much of the distress and pain is found. And you can't, it needs time, it needs space, it needs opportunity to speak the truth of what's happened so that you can find healing and find healing in God. And that's not like I suppose it's knowing the peace and the safety that God offers that you can start to find that healing more and more. Yeah, a big part of my counseling approach is storytelling. I love stories. So my brand name is even stories. Um, so and it's about telling the story of what has happened, especially when it comes to trauma. But as I think as something I'm learning, the more and more I'm working in this space, and I don't mean this in a trite way, but trauma, because of the brokenness of this world, there's a lot of us experience trauma, not always big trauma, or not always ongoing trauma, and not always complex trauma. But if we don't have a good framework to understand our trauma and the confuse, like we can end up really confused, and then like there's so much distress that comes, and that's with like mental distress and other distresses that come through that. And the Bible gives us a framework to understand that, because the Bible talks about how we are embodied souls. We are a body and a soul, but they're not separate, they're together. And because of the way that these things impact our body and our soul, we need to then pay attention to both of them together as we unravel the story and find out, like, speak the truth of what's happened, but also bring God's truth into what's happened as well, and see his presence in that, and finding him in the pain of everything that has happened. Yeah, that is all I have notes on.
And the last question, more so speaking to those who are listening and speaking to the Free Reformed Church of Australia. If you can talk to ministers, members, denomination, our assumption, just like every other episode, is the moment that this goes out, the Free Reformed Church of Australia will hear about it and start listening, hate listening, love listening, whatever it may be. So you got their ears,
Yeah,
and they can't respond to you. Um,
yeah.
What should they know about Doug Wilson? What should they know about handling abuse in the church? What should they know about being a place where the gospel of Christ leads us to lift up the downcast and proclaims the grace of God? So you speak to the Free Reformed Church of Australia and say this is what Camille de Vos thinks they should know.
When I first read this question, I was like, I don't know where to start. There's so many things. I just need a few hours to talk about this. Um, but I think I've sort of pulled it into a way that hopefully makes sense and is everything that I would like to say. But I think I'm going to start by addressing those who are hurting or have been hurt. And there are so many stories. And I'm really sorry if that is your story. I I want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever the context, whatever you think of the significance of what has happened, even if it is a once-off thing that happened in passing, it's not okay. And you need to know that you're not alone, and reach out to someone. Reach out. You can talk to me. I can connect you with other people that you can talk to. And there are so many stories, and this is not like, I know there's people who are afraid of a Me Too movement happening in their free reform churches, but maybe that needs to happen. Not in the like vengeful, hateful way, but in a way that's, this is really wrong. No matter what you see as the seriousness of what's happened, it's wrong. And we need to be able to cling to the hope and the healing that God brings. And the first step in doing that is speaking the truth. Because if you don't speak the truth, you can't meet that with God's truth. And as you speak the truth more and more, then you're able to find refuge in the arms of your Heavenly Father. And you can be comforted there. And I think the really sad thing is so many have not just been mistreated, but those who should have been representing God to them really misrepresented him. And if that is your story, and you have also had family members, parents, office bearers, others, teachers, those who should be telling you about who God is, and embodying who God is to you, and they have mistreated you or dismissed what you have brought to them, know that that is not who God is. Your story is really important to him. And if you can hold on to that, then start to talk to God about what happened as well. I know it may seem scary, but he is not the person, he's not the God that you have been taught that he is. He is a God who really, really cares. And it might seem scary, but to live through what you've lived through, you are a very brave person. And talk to others, talk to people that are trustworthy, and start building relationships. To everyone else, we need to start pulling up the carpet. It's a pretty disgusting, I think of the image that comes to mind is the carpet cleaning videos at the beginning, where there's like, it's mud. Everything's been swept under so much that it's just oozing out. So we need to get rid of that carpet, maybe burn it. And we need to start paying attention to what's happening, to what has been happening, and start talking about it, and start finding God's hope and his healing in this. We have a God who is a God of justice. He stands up for the oppressed, and he protects the vulnerable and the weak. He commands us to do that as well. And there is power everywhere, like human relationships. Power is a part of that. But God commands those with power to use it to bless and empower others who have less power, and never to take advantage of them. So if we have a worldview that teaches us that we are more than or greater than or above others, if that's the way that we see the world, things get nasty, and they get nasty really quickly. If you think of Nazi Germany or slavery or apartheid in South Africa or just colonialism, in each of those systems, there was a worldview that taught that like one person was more than another, and there were people who were less than, and they were less than human. And patriarchy, especially as Doug Wilson teaches, or as I have witnessed it in the FRCA, that is a worldview that does the same. It is a worldview that teaches that men are more than and women are less than. And in that worldview and in that way of looking at the world, we take away personhood. Not just the personhood of the women because you treat them as less than, but you're also in treating someone else as less than. You are less than because you are not bearing the image of God as you have been created, because you are not treating someone else who has been created in the image of God right. So we really, really need to change, and we need to pay attention to this. I need to say, because I know this is how you're going to come at me, I am speaking from a place of love. I'm not a crazy feminist. I do not hate men. And I don't hate the FRCA either. I'm not here to attack or bring it down. I have so much love for everyone and so much heart for the hurt. And there are layers and layers and layers of hurt here. And we need to start bringing God's love to that. And there's also no woke agenda attached to this. It's love. It's love for God and love for his people. To ministers and office bearers, just because it may seem normal, it doesn't mean it's right. In fact, sometimes because it's normal, it's very not right. You need to move away from thinking about the system and protecting the system or the way that things are or the way that things have always been, and start listening and loving and paying attention to that and paying attention to the people right in front of you. And remember that God is calling you to love the oppressed and to use your position to lift them up. Don't keep things in-house. Use the resources available, all the resources available, especially the resources of the state, and hold people accountable, especially when what they do is illegal. Consent is not implied with the words I do, and marital rape is real and it is illegal in Australia. And this is again to the community as a whole. Standing up for something is very hard in the Free From Churches of Australia. I think as a community we're quite aware of this. We've seen this happen in different ways of when people have stood up and nasty, nasty things have come after them. But that shouldn't stop us. We need to stand up for what is right. We need to stand up for truth. We need to stand up for God, the gospel. And that includes standing up against assault and abuse and oppression. It's not easy. In fact, it's pretty scary and hard. But this is what God asks us to do, and this is what God does. So he gives us a way that we can do it. His light is shining in the darkness, and he is busy here. And we can hold on to that. And to everyone as well, know that your world is very small and start to make it bigger, because that is another way that you can see how God is working in spaces and in great ways that are not the Free Reformed Church.